Welcome to Soft Sleep Tales, a channel where timeless stories, gentle narration, and quiet atmospheres help you drift into rest. Before we begin tonight's tale, I'd love to know, where are you listening from? Share it in the comments below. It's always wonderful to see our little community stretching across the world. Now, it's time to get comfortable. Settle into your bed or favorite chair. Close your eyes. Take a slow, deep breath. Let the day melt away. Allow my voice to carry you softly into sleep to a place where imagination flows and dreams begin. Mrs. Agnes Drummond rose at 4 o'clock on the morning of the 12th of August, 1883, as she had risen at 4 o'clock on the morning of every 12th of August for the previous 21 years, with the exception of the years when the 12th had fallen on a Sunday and the shooting had been delayed to the 13th. This year was one of those years. The 12th was a Sunday, and therefore the shooting could not begin until the Monday, which was a peculiarity of the calendar she had noted in her kitchen book the previous November, when she had sat down, as she did every winter, to plan the coming season. The plan was in the book now. 2 extra columns of preparation notes, the Monday entry marked in a bracket at the top of the August pages, the roasting schedule adjusted by a day. The plan had been made in November. Now it was August, and she was executing it. She dressed in the dark of her room in the service wing, which was the room she had occupied since 1868, when she had been given the head cook's room at the back of the house, looking north toward the hills. The hills were invisible at 4 o'clock in the morning, but she knew they were there. She had looked at them for 15 years from this window, and she could feel them in the dark, the way she could feel the weather coming before it arrived. This morning, cold, dry, still. A good day for the moor. She lit her candle. She pinned her hair, which was grey-brown and which she kept short enough to pin in under the bone without difficulty. She put on her dress, her apron, her shoes. She went downstairs to the kitchen. The kitchen range was her first act. She had banged it the night before, the larger of the 2 Karen ranges on the north wall, the one she used for the roasting and the main sauces. And she opened the damper now and added coal from the scuttle beside it. The smaller range, the baking range, she would light in an hour when Effie arrived. For now, she needed only the main range and the kettle and her tea. The kitchen book had begun in 1869, in the winter between Agnes's 2nd and 3rd years as head cook at Ardvreck, in a period of quiet when the family was in Edinburgh, and the house was reduced to a skeleton staff, and the kitchen had the particular stillness of a working room at rest. She had found herself, in the evenings of that quiet winter, writing down the recipes she had accumulated in her head over 20 years of cooking in Highland houses, the recipes she had been taught by the cook at Hunting Tower Lodge when she was 12, the recipes she had gathered during her years as second cook at Strathgarry, the recipes she had asked for and been given and tested and kept from the cooks at the other houses where the guests came from and went back to, bringing their kitchen's knowledge with them, as guests unknowingly always do. The first notebook had been a small quarto, bought in Pitlochry. The recipes had been written in her best hand, the hand she reserved for important documents, and each one had been given its source and its date, and a note at the bottom of the entry recording the result of the test. Not all the tests had been satisfactory. Some recipes had been returned to the notebook with a note reading, "Fair, requires adjustment." Some with "Good," some with "Excellent," "Keep," a few with a single word, "Discard." 14 years and 15 notebooks. Later, the kitchen book occupied a shelf on the kitchen dresser between the receipt book and the almanac, in positions that had not changed since 1869. The current notebook was number 15. It was open on the dresser now, at the August pages, with the shooting season's menus and the recipe notes Agnes had been adding since July. She took her tea to the dresser and stood reading the August entries. Roast grouse, obviously. The first birds always went to the table on the evening of the first day of shooting and required only the basics. The birds hung one day, the roasting at a strong heat, the bread sauce, the game chips, the watercress. Simple food, done well. She had written the recipe in the book in 1872 and had not changed a word of it since. Some things did not require improvement. At 5:30, Hamish Mackenzie knocked at the kitchen door with 3 sharp knocks, which was the knock that meant, "I have game." The other knocks meant other things. 2 slow knocks, something to discuss. 1 knock with a pause, and then 1 more, a question. Agnes had known Hamish's knocks for 21 years and could read them the way she read the weather. She opened the door. He was standing on the kitchen step in the Highland morning, a tall man of 62, wiry, with the weather-burned face of a man who spent his working life outside, wearing the same flat cap and the same tweed jacket he wore every morning of the year, regardless of the season, which was the jacket he had bought in Pitlochry in 1879, and on which showed it. He never came inside the kitchen. He had never come inside the kitchen in 21 years. There was a boundary at the kitchen door, and both of them understood it. He had a brace of birds in each hand, 4 grouse, shot that morning before the Sunday rule came into effect. "First of the season," he said. "Not the glorious 12th, of course. Not this year with the Sunday complication. But the birds had been checked this morning at first light on the moor above the house, and these 4 were early risers caught in the legal half-hour before the Sunday rule applied. Hamish's reading of the Game Act was his own, but Agnes had never questioned it in 21 years. She took the birds. They were warm still, the plumage in excellent condition, the bodies heavy with the season's growth. She held one up in the morning light and looked at the breast. "Young bird, good season. Tomorrow then," she said. "Early," he said. "First light they'll be out. You'll have the birds by 7. She nodded. He left. She brought the birds in and hung them in the game larder. 1 day's hanging required for young grouse, 2 for the older birds she would get later in the season. Tomorrow the party would be 20 on the moor, and she would need 16 birds for the evening dinner. The party from London arrived on the Sunday afternoon train from Perth, which reached Pitlochry at 3:30, and from which the Macpherson family's wagonettes collected the guests for the 12-mile drive to Ardvreck. Agnes had the information from the footman at noon. 14 guests in addition to the family, 18 for dinner. She worked through the afternoon with Effie beside her, the kitchen at its controlled pre-season pace that was not yet the full pace, but was approaching it. The Sunday dinner was a transitional meal. The guests had travelled. They were tired. They did not want ceremony. But it was also the first impression of Ardvreck's table and Agnes took first impressions seriously. She had been making first impressions for 21 years, and she had never sent out a Sunday arrival dinner she was not satisfied with. Effie Gillies was 17 and had been in the kitchen since 1882, a year of basic training, the year of learning the range, the stoves, the batterie de cuisine, the larder system, the particular rhythms of Ardvreck's working week. She was from Dunkeld, which was Agnes's own town, and she was the daughter of Agnes's cousin's daughter, which made her family in the particular way that Highland connections calculated family, close enough to trust, far enough that the trust had been earned rather than assumed. Agnes watched Effie working the soup. The soup for Sunday arrival was a cock-a-leekie. The leeks from the kitchen garden, the chicken from this morning, the prunes that came from a jar in the stores, a long-cooked broth, filling and kind, the right thing for tired travellers. Effie had made it before under supervision. Today she made it with Agnes nearby, but not intervening. The soup was good. Agnes tasted it at 5 o'clock. She added a pinch of salt and looked at Effie. Effie tasted it. "The salt," Effie said. "Always the salt at the end when it's been cooked down." Effie nodded. She wrote it in her own small notebook, which was the notebook Agnes had given her at the beginning of the year, and which was the beginning of whatever Effie's own kitchen book might become. The glorious 13th of August, 1883 began for Agnes at 4 o'clock, which was the same time it had begun on the 12th and the 11th, and every morning of the season, and every morning of every season for 21 years. The difference between the 13th of August, 1883, and every other morning was that by 7:30, Hamish had knocked his 3 sharp knocks 16 times, and the game larder contained 16 grouse, 8 brace, the morning's first take from the moor above the house. She hung the birds in rows on the larder's iron hooks, which ran along the ceiling in 2 parallel lines, each hook spaced precisely the width of a bird apart. The larder was the coldest room in the service wing, built against the north wall of the house where the Highland sun never reached it. The floor flagged with the same grey granite as the rest of the building, the walls thick enough that the temperature inside stayed within a range that never varied more than 2 or 3 degrees, regardless of what the weather outside was doing. She had been using this larder for 21 years and knew it the way she knew the range, its cold corners, its air currents, its smells. Young birds did not need more than a day. Old birds, the ones Hamish brought later in the season, in September and October, when the young birds had largely been taken, needed 2 days, sometimes 3. Agnes could read a grouse by the feel of the breast and the condition of the feet within 30 seconds of handling it, and she made her hanging decisions accordingly. The 16 birds this morning were all young. They would come off the hooks tomorrow afternoon and go onto the spit by 6 o'clock. She wrote in the kitchen book, August 13th, 1883. Opening day, 16 birds, all young, excellent condition. 1 day's hang, party of 18 for dinner. The roasting of grouse was not complicated. It was the kind of cooking that appeared simple and was simple, provided the cook understood what simple meant in this context, that simplicity required better ingredients, better timing, and more precise attention than any complicated dish. A complicated dish could disguise itself under sauces and accompaniments. A roast grouse was entirely naked. It either was what it was or it was not. Agnes prepared the birds for the spit on the afternoon of the 13th, after the party had come back from the moor. She could hear them in the dining room, the voices of 20 people who had spent a day outdoors, with the systematic efficiency that came from having done the same preparation on the same afternoon of August for every year of her time at Ardvreck. She drew and trussed the birds with the speed of long practice. She placed a pat of butter and a piece of red currant jelly inside each one. She laid a rasher of bacon across the breast of each bird and tied it in place. She turned to Effie, who was watching. "Why the bacon?" "To protect the breast," Effie said. She had been told this the previous year. She had the answer. More than that, the breast of a young grouse is very lean and will dry in the high heat before the legs are cooked through. The bacon provides fat as well as protection. After 20 minutes, you remove the bacon and return the birds to the heat to brown. 2 stages. First, the gentle cooking under the bacon, then the browning. She turned back to the birds. The bread sauce must be on by 5, the chips at 5:30, the watercress dressed at the last moment, not before. The birds went onto the spit at 6 o'clock. Agnes watched them for the first 20 minutes herself, not because Effie could not have done it, but because the first grouse of the season was the first grouse of the season, and she had been watching it herself for every year of her time at Ardvreck, and she was not going to stop. After the dinner service, when the last plate had gone up and the kitchen had settled to its after-service quiet, the pans scraped and stacked for Effie and the kitchen maid to wash, the range banked for the night, the larder door checked. Agnes went into the game larder with a candle and stood for a few minutes among the hanging birds. This was a thing she had done for as long as she could remember doing it. The end-of-day check of the larder, which was also something beyond a check, a form of inventory that was not entirely practical. The larder in the evening smelled of game and cold stone and the faint metallic note of fresh meat. And it was the quietest room in the house because no voice came through the thick granite walls, and no heat came from the ranges, and no light came in except what she brought with her. She stood there and looked at the birds on the hooks. 8 birds remaining after tonight's service. Tomorrow morning, Hamish would bring more. The season was in its first hours. The guests had eaten well. She had heard it from the footman who came down after service to report. "Excellent, Mrs. Drummond." Colonel Macpherson said he had not had better grouse. The colonel said the same thing every year, and Agnes received it the same way every year, with a small nod, because the colonel was correct, and because his being correct was not an accident, but the result of the previous 24 hours of her work. She stood in the larder with her candle and the hanging birds and the cold stone and thought about nothing in particular. The season had begun. The kitchen was in order. Tomorrow was another day of it. On the 3rd day of the season, the Wednesday, Agnes gave Effie the luncheon. Not the dinner. The dinner was 20 covers, and Agnes ran the dinner herself with Effie beside her. But the luncheon was 12 covers and a simpler menu, and it was time to find out what Effie could do when the responsibility was genuinely hers. Agnes explained this on Tuesday evening after service in the brief end-of-day conversation at the kitchen dresser that had become their working habit. She would be there, Agnes said. She would not intervene unless there was a real difficulty. The menu was Tay salmon poached with a fennel broth, a roast fillet of Aberdeen Angus with a bone marrow sauce, and a cranachan with Perthshire raspberries. Not a complicated menu. Good ingredients, well handled. Effie went home to her room in the service wing and presumably thought about it. She was back in the kitchen at 5 o'clock on Wednesday morning, 45 minutes earlier than usual, which told Agnes what she needed to know about Effie's assessment of the situation. The luncheon service was not perfect. The salmon was poached 3 minutes too long and was slightly firm. The marrow sauce was good. The cranachan was the best Agnes had tasted from Effie's hands. When the last dish had gone up and come back, Agnes stood with Effie at the preparation table and went through each item, the salmon, the timing, what should have been different. She did not soften the observation about the salmon, but she also did not enlarge it. 3 minutes, too long. For next time, 3 minutes less. Write it in your book, Agnes said. Effie wrote, Tay salmon, poaching time. Watch the 3rd minute carefully. It is not the same time every time. Good, Agnes said. The full shooting party dinner on the 4th evening, Friday the 15th, was the largest dinner of the opening week, and the one Agnes planned most carefully. 20 covers, 4 courses, the full service with the footman, and the plate warming, and the sequence of dishes that had to arrive at the table in the right condition at the right intervals. She had been running dinners of this kind since 1870, and she ran them with a quiet authority that the dining room above did not see and could not have described. The menu for Friday the 15th, August 1883, as recorded in the kitchen book: Scotch broth, poached Tay salmon with cucumber and dill sauce, roast saddle of Highland venison with a red wine sauce and root vegetables, grouse in a cream sauce for the removes, cranachan with Dundee shortbread. 5 courses, each arriving in the correct sequence, each at the correct temperature, each representing the particular produce of this particular part of Perthshire at this particular moment of the year. Agnes moved through the service with the calm that long experience produced, not the calm of someone who was not attending to the work, but the calm of someone for whom the work had become entirely natural. She tasted everything. She sent back the venison sauce the first time and had Effie reduce it further. She kept one eye on the grouse and one on the time. She directed the footman on the timing of each course with a nod or a word, not interrupting the flow of the service to explain herself. At 10 o'clock, when the last dessert plates had come down and the kitchen was in its post-service state of organized exhaustion, Agnes stood at the range with her cup of tea and wrote in the kitchen book, August 15th, Friday dinner, 20 covers. Venison sauce needed a second reduction. 10 more minutes. Cranachan well received. All timing correct, except the venison, which arrived 2 minutes late. Adjust Thursday prep schedule. The kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, after a full service, was Agnes's favourite time of the day. The guests were in the drawing room or in their beds. The footmen had gone to their quarters. Effie and the kitchen maids had scrubbed the pans and gone to bed. The ranges were banked. The larder was checked and closed. The batterie de cuisine was hung back on its wall. Agnes sat at the kitchen table with her tea and her kitchen book. She wrote the day's entries in the quiet, not the brief operational notes she made during the day, but the fuller entries she saved for this evening hour. The observations about the ingredients, the adjustments to the recipes, the notes on what had worked and what had not. The kitchen book was a working document and a thinking document, and the thinking required the quiet that the evening gave her. She turned to the entry for the venison sauce, first written in 1878, when she had developed the current version from a recipe given her by the cook at Megany Castle, tested it, and added her own amendments. The reduction time she had written in 1878 was 30 minutes. She added a note in the current year's hand. For the Macpherson saddle in the heavy-bottomed pan, 35 minutes. The pan holds heat differently. The sauce recipe was correct for the original pan. The pan has changed. This was what the kitchen book was for. Not merely to hold the recipes, but to accumulate the amendments, the corrections that 20 years of working with the same ingredients in the same kitchen produced, the knowledge that could not be written down in a single entry, because it did not exist in a single entry, but accumulated over years of test and adjustment. She closed the book. She banked the tea kettle for the night. She went to bed. The kitchen was in order. Tomorrow was another day of it. The stag season opened in the Highlands on the 12th of August, in the same way the grouse season opened, but the deer came into the kitchen in a different way from the grouse. The deer came whole, or nearly whole. The gamekeeper and the gillie did the gralloching on the hill and brought the carcass in on the pony, and Hamish and his boy hung it in the game larder for the required number of days before Agnes began work on it. The number of days depended on the beast. A young stag, killed cleanly, in good condition. 4 days minimum, 5 preferable. An older stag, heavier, or one that had run hard before it fell. 3 days and no more, because the older flesh was already doing what it would do and needed less time to do it. Agnes had been making this assessment for 21 years, and she made it quickly. 1 hand on the haunch, a breath in through the nose, a look at the neck. The first stag of 1883 came in on the 18th of August, a young Highland stag. Colonel Macpherson shot, a fine head of 10 points that would go to the taxidermist and end on the hall wall alongside its predecessors. The carcass went to the game larder. Agnes wrote, August 18th, first stag. Young beast, clean kill, good condition. 5 days. She counted forward. The 23rd, a Tuesday. The first venison dinner would be a Tuesday dinner for 16. Venison required different thinking from grouse. Grouse was a simple roast from fresh game. Venison was a long preparation, the marinade, the hanging time calculated precisely, the different cuts requiring different methods. The saddle went on the spit, as it always did. The haunches Agnes preferred for a slow braise, with claret and root vegetables, which was the recipe from the cook at Megany Castle, and which she had been using, with amendments, since 1878. The remaining cuts became the potted venison, which went into the larder for winter, and the venison broth, which appeared on the table in October. The salmon from the River Tay was the other great product of the Ardvreck season. The Tay ran through Macpherson land for approximately 2 miles east of the house, and in late August and September, the salmon were running, and what the river gillie and the colonel's guests could catch in a morning's fishing could be extraordinary. The kitchen received salmon 2 or 3 times a week through the season, sometimes a single fish, sometimes half a dozen, depending on the run and the skill of the rods. Agnes's approach to salmon was the opposite of her approach to venison. With venison, she did a great deal, marinating, hanging, braising, seasoning, the long, slow work of turning a large and complex piece of meat into something precisely cooked. With salmon, she did almost nothing. The salmon from the Thai in September was perfect, and the kindest thing a cook could do with it was leave it alone, which in practice meant poach it in the lightest possible court bouillon for the exact number of minutes that its weight and thickness required, and serve it with a plain cucumber sauce and very good bread. This was in the kitchen book. The recipe read, Tay salmon, August to September, poached. The fish at its best needs no accompaniment beyond a plain sauce and good bread. The cook's only work is the timing. Weigh the fish. Calculate 12 minutes per pound up to 4 pounds, 10 minutes per pound for larger fish. Do not overcook. There is no recovery from an overcooked salmon. She had written that last sentence in 1875, after a disaster of her own making. A salmon she had overcooked by 3 minutes in her first year of managing the fish. She had kept the note because it was true, and because she wanted to keep it in front of her, and because the lesson was not only about salmon. There is no recovery from an overcooked salmon. Many things were like that. Agnes had been writing to John Ross, head cook at Struan House near Blair Athol, for 11 years, since the winter of 1872, when the two women had been introduced at the Pitlochry Provisioners by their respective housekeepers, and had found, in a half-hour conversation over the order for dried goods, that they shared an interest in recipe collecting and a similar view of the limits of Mrs. Beeton. The letters were not frequent, perhaps 6 a year, more in the winter when both kitchens were quiet, and they followed a pattern that had established itself without being agreed upon. A practical opening about the current season's produce, or a question about a technique, followed by a longer section that was the real exchange, a recipe or two passing from one kitchen to the other, with the notes and amendments that made them useful rather than merely interesting. John's letter of the 21st of August came with a recipe for a venison collop, with a sauce of rowan berries and red wine, which John described as having been given to her by the cook at Dalnacardock Lodge the previous autumn, and which she had tested and found very good. The rowan berries, John wrote, made the difference. The old recipes for venison collops used red currant jelly, which was fine but too sweet. The rowan was sharper, more like the flavour of the moor, and it was correct. Agnes read the letter at the kitchen dresser in the evening of the 22nd. She looked at the recipe. She looked at the rowan berries. They were in the garden, the tree in the corner of the kitchen yard that had been there since before Agnes arrived, producing its annual harvest of red berries that she had been making into jelly for 20 years. She had never thought to use them in a venison sauce. She replied the same evening, "I will try the rowan venison collop this week. If it is what you say, I will add it to the book." She paused, then added, "You are, as always, ahead of me in this." On a Wednesday evening in the last week of August, Agnes sat at the kitchen dresser after service and spent an hour going through the kitchen book from the beginning of the year. This was a thing she did 3 or 4 times in the course of the year. The full reading back of the current notebook, the review of what had been written and what it meant and what needed to be added. The dresser was her favorite seat in the kitchen at this hour. The range to her right, still warm from the service, ticking as it cooled. The copper pans on the wall in front of her, caught in the lamplight. The high kitchen window showing nothing but the dark of a Highland August night. The kitchen maids in bed, Effie in bed. The house above quiet. She turned through the year's entries slowly. The February bread recipe that she had written in the cold of the winter kitchen. The amendment to the marmalade method that had come from a Dundee supplier's note in March. The first grouse entries from this month. Each entry had its date and its source and its note. The notes accumulated. The notebook was perhaps 2/3 full. By December, it would be complete, and the 16th notebook would be opened. She thought about the 15 notebooks on the shelf. 14 years and a little more of cooking in this kitchen, recorded in these volumes. If she were to leave Ardvreck, which she would not, but if she were, the notebooks would remain. The Macpherson family would have 15 volumes of tested Highland cooking, with sources and amendments, covering every kind of produce the estate produced and every kind of occasion the house hosted. The knowledge was in the notebooks. She thought further, and the notebooks would be useless to anyone who did not know how to cook. The knowledge was in the notebooks and also in the hands. Both were required. Agnes made the roan venison collop on the Friday of the last week of August, the day after she had tested the rowan berries from the kitchen yard tree for ripeness. Good, bright red, still firm. Another week would improve them, but they were ready. And the day after she had decided that John Ross's recipe deserved its own trial before the season ended. The collop was a thin cut of venison haunch, browned quickly in the pan and then finished in the sauce. The sauce was Jean's, the rowan berries, mashed and pressed through a sieve to remove the seeds, combined with the pan juices and a glass of red wine and a small amount of stock, reduced until it coated a spoon. Agnes made it exactly as written, which was her practice with all new recipes on the first test. You tested the recipe as given before you amended it, so that you knew what you were amending. She tasted the sauce alone before adding the venison. The rowan was there, sharp, herbal, with the slight bitterness of the berry that the wine softened without eliminating. John had been correct. Red currant jelly was too sweet. This was something else. The flavour of the moor, as Jean had said. She let Effie taste it. "What does it taste like?" Agnes said. Effie thought, "The hill." Agnes nodded. "That's what it should taste like." She turned back to the pan. "Write it in your book. The rowan berry sauce for venison. Sauce, Mrs. Ross, Struan House. Test, Ardvreck, August 1883. Result, excellent." She wrote the same in her own book, with the amendment she had already identified. 1 extra minute of reduction for the large pan. Jean's recipe was for a smaller pan. The transfer was now complete. September was the deepest month of the Highland season. The grouse shooting continued. The stag stalking was at its peak, with the stags moving onto the lower ground as the autumn progressed, and the red deer in their September condition. The Tay salmon were running their best run of the year, the great autumn fish moving upriver from the sea. Agnes's September kitchen was the most demanding kitchen of the year. The volume of produce coming in from the estate was at its maximum. Grouse in every stage of aging, from the young birds of the first days to the older birds that required different handling. Venison from the 2 or 3 stags. The colonel and his guests shot each week, salmon several times a week, the kitchen garden producing its autumn harvest of root vegetables and brassicas and the last of the soft fruits, the dairy producing heavily in the autumn flush. She was running on less sleep than at any other time of the year, rising at 4 and returning to bed sometimes as late as midnight. Effie, to her credit, was rising at 4 as well, and had not once requested an exception. She had understood, from observation rather than from being told, that in September the kitchen did not have a schedule for exceptions. She worked with a quiet steadiness that Agnes had noted and was noting again this month, not because it was surprising, but because it was good and worth noting. A 17-year-old girl from Dunkeld who rose at 4 in September without being asked to. Agnes wrote in the book in the middle of September, "Effie Gillies is becoming a cook." On a Thursday evening in the second week of September, Agnes returned to the kitchen after a brief hour in her room to find Effie at the kitchen dresser with the oldest of the kitchen books open in front of her, the first notebook from 1869, the small quarto in which the book had begun. Effie was reading it. She had the book flat on the dresser, and she was turning the pages slowly, reading each entry with the close attention Agnes had seen her give to the recipe descriptions during demonstrations. She had not heard Agnes come in. Agnes stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment before speaking. She could see from where she stood the page Effie was reading, the original Cocker-Leaky entry from the winter of 1869, the first recipe Agnes had written into the first notebook. With its source, Agnes's grandmother's kitchen in Dunkeld, 1855, and its note, tested and correct. The prunes are essential. The notebook was 14 years old, and the pages had the look of a document that had been handled often. "You may read it," Agnes said. Effie looked up, startled. Then, because she was Effie, and had the good sense that Agnes had hoped for when she had asked for her from Dunkeld, she did not apologize at length. She said, "How far back does it go?" 14 years in these notebooks. Before that, it was in my head only. What happened to it? In your head, before you wrote it down. I worried about it, Agnes said. I worried that when I was gone, it would be gone too. That is why I wrote it down. Effie absorbed this. She looked at the open page, and then at the shelf of notebooks. Then she said, "Then someday, I should have notebooks too." "You already do," Agnes said. "Yours is in your apron pocket." The last guests of the 1883 season left Ardvreck on the 3rd of October, which was the Thursday after the Colonel's final shooting week, and which marked the transition from the season's pace to the house's quiet pace that Agnes both welcomed and had mixed feelings about. The welcoming part was straightforward. September had been exhausting. The September kitchen having been the most demanding in Agnes's memory of the last several years, with a run of guests that had not relented and a series of large dinners that had kept her at the range until midnight on 6 consecutive occasions. She was 56 years old, and she felt it in October in a way she had not felt it in October 20 years ago. The mixed feelings were also straightforward. The season was the kitchen's full life. The winter was its reduced life. The winter was necessary. Necessary for Agnes to rest. Necessary for the kitchen to be prepared for the following year. Necessary for the slower work of the kitchen book that the season made impossible. But the first few weeks after the season always had the quality of an instrument put down between performances. The knowledge that it was the right time to put it down, and the awareness that the instrument was silent. She spent the 3rd of October, after the guests' departure, on the winter preparation. The game larder cleared and scrubbed, the summer battery cleaned and rehung, the preserving that remained from September completed and shelved. She wrote in the book at the end of the day, October 3rd, season closed, good year, party of 18 for 8 weeks, no serious failures. Effie ready for the winter's teaching. The weeks of October were the preserving weeks, and preserving was the work Agnes found most satisfying of all the kitchen's seasonal tasks, for reasons she had thought about occasionally but never entirely resolved. Perhaps it was the knowledge that the summer's and autumn's produce would last into the winter, transformed by the cook's work from perishable to permanent. Perhaps it was the orderly quality of the work itself, the progression from raw material to finished jar, the same method applied to different ingredients, the shelves filling in a predictable sequence. Perhaps it was the fact that preserving was the one kitchen work that was entirely hers. The jams and jellies and potted meats that came from Ardvreck's kitchen reflected exclusively Agnes's judgments about what was worth preserving and how. She made the rowan jelly from the kitchen yard tree first, because the berries were at their peak and would not wait. She had been making rowan jelly at Ardvreck since her 2nd year as second cook, and the recipe in the book was now amended 4 times over the original, each amendment recording a specific improvement she had arrived at through testing. The first amendment in 1865, reducing the sugar slightly. The second in 1871, adding the juice of a single lemon. The third in 1878, changing the setting point from her earlier estimate to a more reliable test using a cold saucer. The fourth and most recent in 1882, adjusting the boiling time for the larger preserving pan she had acquired that year. The rowan jelly of 1883 was, on tasting, the best she had made. She wrote this in the book without false modesty. 1883 rowan jelly, the best yet. The berries were in excellent condition. A dry summer had concentrated the flavor. The amended method is now correct. No further changes required. Effie stood at the second range and did the second batch herself. Agnes tasted it. The set. A little soft. A little soft. Which means 3 more minutes. Effie returned the pan to the heat. On the last day of October, Agnes wrote the month's closing summary in the kitchen book. She wrote, October 1883, end of season and preserving complete. Rowan, jelly, 12 jars, bramble jelly, 8 jars, damson jam, 6 jars, potted venison, 10 jars, potted how, 8 jars, pickled walnuts, 2 jars, the Colonel's requirement, dried herbs from the kitchen garden, thyme, rosemary, sage, bay, stores adequate for winter, larder now at winter stock. Below the inventory she wrote, as she usually wrote in the end-of-month summary, season assessment. The 1883 shooting season was the best of the last 5 years in terms of produce. Excellent grouse, good venison, exceptional salmon. Kitchen performance, satisfactory throughout except the venison sauce delay on August 15th, since corrected. Effie Gillies, progressing well. Has mastered the soups, the preserves, the basic pastry, and the fish. The roasting and the larger braised dishes remain for winter work. She paused. Then she wrote, "The Rowan venison from Mrs. Ross was the best new recipe of the year." Added to the book as a permanent entry. I will write to John this week to tell her so. She closed the book. She went to the window. October at Ardvreck had the particular Highland quality of a good October. The hills visible across the fields in their full autumn colour, the birches gold against the dark of the pines, the sky the clear pale blue that came when the weather was cold and dry and still. The kitchen yard was swept and quiet. The kitchen behind her was swept and quiet. It was a good place to have spent 21 years. She would spend the winter here too, as she had spent every winter here since 1862, and in the spring the Colonel and Lady Helen would return from Edinburgh, and the kitchen would begin its preparations for the season to come. November arrived at Ardvreck as it always arrived in the Highland autumn, without ceremony, replacing October's clear cold light with the grey that would stay until March. The family had gone to Edinburgh in the last week of October, leaving the house in the care of the housekeeper and the indoor staff, and the kitchen with Agnes. The kitchen in November was 4 people, Agnes, Effie, and 2 kitchen maids who were responsible for the scullery and the basic daily cooking for the remaining servants. It was the smallest the kitchen would ever be. Agnes had been running the winter kitchen for 21 years, and she had come to value it in the way that a teacher values the period when only the serious students remain. The season was for performance. The winter was for learning. She had Effie's full attention, a kitchen with no competing demands, and 4 months in which to give Effie what she needed for the following season. She laid out the plan in the first week of November at the kitchen dresser, in the evening session that became the winter's teaching rhythm. Not a written plan. It existed in Agnes's head, where it had been forming since September, when she had written in the book, "Effie ready for the winter's teaching." The roasting and the braised dishes, the bread, the pastry at the level of a first cook, the stock making, which was the foundation of everything, and which Effie had not yet done properly, the kitchen book itself, which Effie needed to understand as a document and not merely a reference. The first serious winter lesson was the stock, which Agnes began in the second week of November. She had delayed it until then because she wanted Effie to have recovered her energy from September before attempting the most demanding of the kitchen's foundational tasks. The stock was demanding not because it was complicated, it was not, but because it required an understanding of the kitchen's logic that most young cooks did not have until they had been cooking for several years. A stock was not a recipe, it was a principle. The principle was this: every good liquid in the kitchen, every sauce, every braise, every soup, began with the stock. If the stock was good, the thing made from it was good. If the stock was poor, no addition could make the thing from it better than poor. The stock was not the meal. The stock was what made the meal possible. Agnes made this argument to Effie while they were preparing the bones for the first stock of November. Effie listened. She had the quality Agnes valued most in a student. She did not ask questions before she needed to. She listened, and when she had something to ask, she asked it precisely. Why do you roast the bones first? Color and flavor. The roasting caramelizes the surface. An unroasted bone gives a pale, mild stock. A roasted bone gives a deep stock. And a pale stock is inferior. Not inferior, different. There are dishes that require a pale stock. You will learn which ones. But for the game stocks and the venison braises, the roasted bone is correct. Effie wrote this in her notebook that evening. She wrote, stock, the foundation. Roasted bones for color and depth. The stock is what makes the meal possible. She did not copy Agnes's words exactly, which Agnes would have noticed if she had read the notebook that evening. Effie had translated the argument into her own language, which was what you wanted a student to do. The first snow of the winter came on the 9th of November, which was early for the Perthshire Valley. The hills above had been white since October, but the snow had not reached the house until now, and when it did, it came in the night and covered the kitchen yard in 2 inches of white and muffled the morning sounds in the way that only snow muffled them. Agnes stood at the kitchen window before 5 o'clock with her tea and looked at the snow in the yard. The kitchen was warm and the window was cold, and the contrast between the warm air on her face and the cold glass under her hand was the particular physical experience of a November kitchen that she associated with the start of the quiet winter. The snow in the yard was undisturbed. The kitchen maid would bring the coals in another hour and make the first footprints, but for now, the yard was unmarked. She thought about the season just finished. She thought about the 16 notebooks on the dresser. She thought about Effie, who was in her room in the service wing, and who would be down in an hour, having not been told to come down early, but having, Agnes suspected, set her own internal clock to the same hour as Agnes's. The November kitchen was teaching Effie's body as much as her hands. She stood at the window until the first grey light came into the yard. The snow looked different in the first light. Not white, but pale blue-grey, the same colour as the dawn sky, the particular Highland dawn colour that appeared only in November and December, and that she had been watching from this kitchen window for 21 years without growing accustomed to it. She refilled her tea. She went back to the range. The family returned from Edinburgh for Christmas in the 2nd week of December, which gave Agnes 3 weeks to prepare the Christmas kitchen. 3 weeks was sufficient. She had prepared the Christmas kitchen at Ardvreck 21 times, and the Christmas preparations required a routine rather than an improvisation. The Christmas cake baked 6 weeks in advance and fed with brandy at weekly intervals. It was already in the larder from November. The shortbread made in the last week before Christmas, when the tins were ready. The mince pies assembled on the 23rd. The goose and the joint prepared on Christmas Eve. She gave Effie the shortbread. Not because shortbread was a simple task. It was not. The ratio of butter to flour and the mixing technique were both critical, and an impatient hand or an imprecise measurement would produce a hard biscuit rather than the crumbling tenderness that was the point of it. But because Effie had been doing the morning baking for 6 weeks, and her pastry hand was now confident, shortbread was the next test. Effie made the shortbread on the 20th of December in 3 batches. The first batch was good. The second was better. The third was Agnes's standard, crumbling and buttery and correctly thin, cut into the correct fingers and baked to the correct pale gold. The third batch, Agnes said. I know, Effie said. The first 2 were too firm. Why? I was overworking the mixture. I changed the mixing technique on the third batch. Faster, lighter. Agnes nodded. She took a piece of the third batch. She ate it. She said, write down the third batch technique, not the first 2. The Christmas dinner of 1883 was for 12. The Colonel and Lady Helen, their son Robert and his wife from London, 3 cousins from Edinburgh, and various household guests. Agnes made the menus a week in advance and wrote them in the kitchen book. Christmas Eve supper, Scotch broth, potted venison on toast, oatcakes and cheese. Christmas Day dinner, clear turtle soup from a tin, the Colonel's tradition. Roast goose with sage and onion stuffing, boiled haunch of ham, roast saddle of mutton, rowan jelly from the kitchen stores, Brussels sprouts and roasted parsnips from the kitchen garden, plum pudding with brandy butter, shortbread. The Christmas dinner was the year's most formal dinner, and the one at which Agnes permitted herself the least improvisation. She had been cooking Christmas dinner at Ardvreck since her first year here, and the menu had settled into its current form in approximately 1874 and had not substantially changed since. Not because she was incapable of change, but because the Macpherson family expected a certain Christmas dinner at Ardvreck, had always had it, and the certainty of the expected was in this case the right thing. Effie handled the soups and the pudding. Agnes handled the roasts. The service was at 2 o'clock, and it was ready at 2 o'clock, which was the way Agnes required it to be ready. At 4:30, when the last course had cleared and the kitchen was in its post-Christmas exhaustion, Agnes sat at the table with her cup of tea and allowed herself the particular rest that Christmas afternoon produced. A day's work well done at the end of a year's work well done. She wrote in the book, Christmas 1883. All well. Effie managed the pudding. Good work throughout. January at Ardvreck was the quietest month of the year. The Christmas guests had gone. The family was in a post-Christmas quietude that expressed itself in reduced demands on the kitchen. And the days were short and dark, and the hills were white, and the kitchen was warm, and everything was in a state of hibernation, except the ranges, which Agnes kept burning, because a cold kitchen was a slow kitchen, and a slow kitchen in January was a kitchen that would be unprepared when the season came. She used January for the deep work of the kitchen book, the annual review, the copying out of recipes that had been written in too rapid notes during the season into their proper permanent form, the comparison of this year's entries with previous year's entries for the same dishes. She spent 2 or 3 evenings each week at the kitchen dresser with the book and a lamp, the work of making the informal formal and the temporary permanent. The January work also included the letter to John Ross, which Agnes wrote in the first week of January and which reported on the year's kitchen. The rowan venison in particular. She told Jean that it had been the best new recipe of the year and that it was now in the book as a permanent entry. The shortbread lesson with Effie, the stock teaching. She described Effie's progress because she knew Jean would find it interesting. Jean had trained 2 cooks of her own over the years and understood the particular satisfaction and particular anxiety of watching someone learn. John's January letter arrived the following week. It contained a new recipe, a marmalade made with Seville oranges and a small amount of whiskey from a cook in Edinburgh who had given it to Jean at the Pitlochry Provisioners in December. Agnes read it at the dresser and wrote immediately in her own book, "Try the whiskey marmalade when the Seville oranges arrive in late January." Agnes set Effie the Scotch broth in January as the test of her stock-making knowledge. The Scotch broth was the test she used for this purpose because it required everything the stock lessons had taught and displayed the results transparently. A good broth was a clear, deep, flavorful liquid with the barley swelled to tenderness and the vegetables cut correctly and the lamb or mutton at exactly the right stage of cooking. A broth made with a poor stock was a thin broth. There was no hiding it. She told Effie on a Monday evening, the Scotch broth for the family luncheon on Wednesday. No supervision. The full recipe as you understand it. Agnes would taste it at noon before it went to the table. Wednesday at noon, Agnes tasted the broth. It was good. Not perfect. The barley had been added slightly late and was not quite as swelled as it should have been, but good, and the stock was clearly right, which was the primary thing. The barley, Agnes said. Effie had already identified it. I added it 15 minutes too late. I was watching the lamb, and I left the barley too long. 2 things in the pot, the lamb and the barley, and they have different timings. How do you manage 2 things with different timings? You calculate both timings when you start, and you note the clock times for each addition. Yes, Agnes said. Write it in your book. Scotch, broth. Calculate the barley timing at the start, not when the lamb seems nearly done. Effie wrote it. She also wrote, below the instruction, the broth was good, the stock was right. I can make the stock now. On the 18th of January, a Tuesday evening, Agnes spent 2 hours at the kitchen dresser in the extended writing session she set aside once or twice a month in the winter for the major kitchen book work. The entries that required more than the operational notes she made in the margins of the day, the entries that required the proper articulation of what she knew. She was writing the chapter on game, not a chapter in the usual sense, because the kitchen book was not organized into chapters, but a long entry that gathered together everything she had learned about game cooking in 21 years of the Ardvreck kitchen. She had been working on it since November, adding sections as the winter gave her time. The grouse section first, then the venison, now the salmon and the pheasant and the smaller game. The entry was the longest she had written in any of the 15 notebooks. It would go into the 16th when the 16th was opened in the spring. She wrote, Game cooking at Ardvreck House, January 1884. This entry is for the cook who comes after me, if that cook wishes to understand what 21 years in this kitchen have established. I have written recipes throughout the kitchen book, and those recipes are correct. But this entry is for something else. The understanding that lies beneath the recipes. The grouse section is the first, and what it says about grouse is also, in part, what it says about all the game in this kitchen. She paused. She looked at what she had written. She had not written a kitchen book entry for a future cook before. She had written for herself, for the self who would read the entry next year or the year after and need the reminder. But this entry was different. She looked at the shelf of 15 notebooks. Then she looked at Effie's apron, hanging on the peg beside the kitchen door. She went back to the writing. The Seville oranges arrived from the Edinburgh provisioner in the last week of January, and Agnes made the whiskey marmalade in the first week of February, following John Ross's recipe with the careful precision she gave to all first tests. The marmalade was made in 2 stages. The oranges boiled whole until the peel was soft, then cut and returned to the liquid with sugar and the addition, at the last stage, after the setting point was reached, of a measure of Perthshire malt whisky. The whisky went in off the heat because boiling would drive the whisky's character away. It was added and stirred once, and then the marmalade went into the jars. She tasted it cold the following morning. The whisky was there, but not dominant. A warmth behind the bitter orange, emerging at the end of the taste, which was exactly where John had said it would be. Agnes thought about this for a moment. Then she made a second batch, reducing the whisky very slightly, 1 spoonful less, because her palate placed the Ardvreck preference a degree quieter than John had written it for the Edinburgh house. She recorded both versions in the book, the source recipe and her amendment, with the explanation. She labelled the first version as Ross Struan House and the second as Ardvreck 1884. 2 marmalades from 1 recipe, each the correct version for its own kitchen. She sent 6 jars of the Ardvreck version to Jean with a covering letter. I have made the amendment you might expect. The whisky is 1 spoonful less than you wrote. For our table, this is correct. For yours, I imagine your version remains correct. At the end of February, Agnes wrote the winter section's closing summary in the kitchen book. She wrote, Winter, 1883 to 84. Teaching. Effie Gillies completed the following to a satisfactory standard. Stock, all types. Scotch broth, shortbread, bread, plain and enriched. Roast poultry, basic game preparation, preserving, jams and jellies, potted meats. Areas remaining for spring and summer work. The larger braises, the souffle, the cold table, the full range of pastry work. Effie's pace of learning is good. She will be ready for a full season's second cook role in August 1884. Below the assessment, she wrote the recipe inventory. The whiskey marmalade added, the Rowan venison collop confirmed as permanent. 3 new minor entries from the correspondence with John Ross and 2 from the Edinburgh cookery book Lady Helen had given her for Christmas. The book was nearly full. The 16th notebook had been bought from Pitlochry in January and was waiting on the shelf. She turned to the back of the current notebook and read what she had written in the game section entry in January. She had not read it since writing it. She read it now as a reader rather than as the writer, and it struck her as being what she had intended it to be, the kind of entry a cook could read and understand the kitchen from. Not a recipe, an understanding. She added a final paragraph to the game entry. I have been cooking in this kitchen for 21 years. I intend to cook here for the rest of my working life, which is perhaps another 10 or 12 years if the body continues as it is. After that, this book will speak for me. I have written it to speak clearly. The family returned from Edinburgh In the third week of March, which was earlier than usual, Lady Helen had written from Edinburgh that she was tired of the city and wanted the Perthshire air. Agnes had the kitchen ready when they arrived, the ranges at full heat, a dinner of the Highland winter produce that Lady Helen preferred when she came back from Edinburgh, which was not the elaborate dinner, but the plain dinner that reminded her she was home. The plain dinner: Scotch broth, a roast leg of Perthshire lamb, potatoes from the store, winter kale from the kitchen garden, a steamed pudding with the last of the bramble jelly from October. Agnes had made this same plain return dinner for 15 years, and it was in the book as Lady Helen's return dinner, with a note: always the broth first, always the kale, always a steamed pudding. She likes the things that are here and not in Edinburgh. The Colonel was with Lady Helen and expressed his satisfaction with the dinner in his usual way, which was to send down a message from the dining room at the end of service: Mrs. Drummond, as good as always. Agnes received the message, as she always received it, with a small nod, because the Colonel was correct, and because his being correct was not an accident. After service, she wrote in the book, beginning the 16th notebook with the date and the entry: March 1884. Family returned. Spring begins. Agnes went to Edinburgh in the first week of April, as she went every April, the annual provisioning trip that combined the practical purchase of the stores that could not be sourced in Perthshire with the visits to the Edinburgh cooks who were her network: the head cook at the Caledonian Hotel, the cook at a house in Moray Place whose employer was a friend of the Colonel's, and, this year, a new connection that John Ross had recommended, a retired cook from a large Glasgow house who had set up a small cookery school in Canongate. The Edinburgh trip was the one occasion in the year when Agnes was not the head cook of Ardvreck House, but simply a person in a city among people who shared her trade. She stayed at the same boarding house in Lothian Road that she had been using for 12 years, managed by a Mrs. Mackay who knew her and gave her the same room each April. She ate her meals at the boarding house table, and she noticed, as she always noticed, the difference between Mrs. Mackay's cooking and her own. Different methods, a different palette of flavours, the difference between an Edinburgh kitchen and a Highland kitchen. She bought 3 cases of claret for the Colonel's cellar, 2 cases of the brandy she used for the Christmas cake and the sauce, the spices that Perthshire could not source in adequate quality, the canned turtle soup, the Colonel's Christmas tradition, the Seville oranges that were not available in the autumn, but that she bought now for next January's marmalade, and the Edinburgh Cookery periodical that came out 4 times a year, and which she subscribed to, and which arrived in Pitlochry's bookseller more or less on time. She wrote in the book from the Edinburgh boarding house on the 3rd night: Edinburgh, April 1884. Stores ordered. Visited: Mrs. Graham at the Caledonian, Mrs. Ferguson at Moray Place, Mrs. Dunbar's cookery school in Canongate. Mrs. Dunbar interesting. Her notes on sauce making I have copied here. She returned from Edinburgh on the Thursday evening of the first week of April, and walked through the kitchen garden on her way in from the wagonette, which was a route she had taken every year since she had started taking the Edinburgh trip, and which was always the arrival moment she most looked forward to. The first look at the kitchen garden after the winter. the first assessment of what the ground had been doing while she had been away. The kitchen garden in the first week of April at Ardvreck was not yet the summer garden. That was still 2 months away. But it was no longer the winter garden either. The first pale green shoots of the broad beans were showing above the brown earth of the bean bed. The onion sets that the gardener had planted in March were sending up their thin green blades. The rhubarb crowns, always the first kitchen crop of the year, had their red and green fists pushing up in the corner bed. Agnes stood in the kitchen garden in the April evening with her Edinburgh basket in one hand and looked at the rhubarb. The first rhubarb of the year was approximately a week away from being pickable. The stems not yet long enough, the green not yet sharp enough to be sweet after cooking. 1 week. She had 1 week to prepare for the rhubarb crumble that was the first spring pudding, and that Lady Helen had been requesting since February. She stood in the garden for 10 minutes. The Perthshire hills were behind her, showing the first tentative green of the April grass above the brown winter heather. The sky was clear. There was no wind. She could hear the river in the distance, the Tummel running high with the spring melt. The kitchen was warm behind her, Effie having banked the range for her arrival. She went in. John Ross came to Ardvreck on a Thursday in the second week of April, which had been arranged by letter in February, and which Agnes had been looking forward to in the careful, measured way she'd looked forward to things. Conscious of the anticipation, but not given to displaying it. John came on the morning train to Pitlochry and was collected by the Ardvreck wagonette and arrived at the kitchen door. The kitchen door, not the front door, which was the correct door for a cook visiting a cook, at 11 o'clock. She was a woman of 53, 2 years Agnes's junior, shorter and more energetic in her movements, with a Perthshire accent slightly different from Agnes's in the way that every Highland valley had its own particular inflection. They had been corresponding for 11 years and had met in person perhaps 8 times over that period, enough to have a relationship that was both professional and genuinely warm without being any of the things that friendship in the ordinary sense was. Agnes showed John the new kitchen book. John read the January game entry, the one written for the cook who comes after, without speaking for 5 minutes. Then she said, "I haven't done this. I should have done this." "You have 2 more years of cooking than I have. There is time. I'll begin this summer." They spent the rest of the morning at the kitchen table with both their current notebooks open and the accumulated correspondence of the last year spread between them, comparing the entries and amending them where comparison showed improvement. Jean's Rowan venison collop, now in both books, both versions annotated with the other cook's test note. Agnes's whiskey marmalade, now in both books, with Jean's amendment of Agnes's amendment. The recipe moving back and forth, improving with each pass. Agnes showed Jean the Seville orange stores from Edinburgh. Jean tasted the marmalade. She said, "Yes, yours is quieter, and it's correct for your table. Mine is also correct for mine." She said this with the certainty of a professional cook who had known her own table for 30 years, and Agnes received it with the same certainty, and they ate the marmalade on oatcakes for their morning tea and talked about what was next in each kitchen. The rhubarb came into the kitchen on the 12th of April, the stems long enough, the colour right. and Lady Helen's rhubarb crumble was made that afternoon by Effie without supervision, which was as it should be, because Effie had been watching Agnes make it for 2 years and had made the pastry component herself the previous spring and knew the method. Agnes tasted the crumble at table. Lady Helen sent down her compliments in the usual way. Agnes passed the message to Effie, who received it with the controlled composure that Agnes had been watching Effie develop over the last 18 months. The composure of a cook who understood that a compliment was a confirmation of the work and not a surprise. May produced the first kitchen garden crops, the new potatoes from the early bed, the first asparagus which the Colonel's gardener had been nursing for 3 years to their first proper harvest, the early peas. Agnes gave Effie the new potatoes and the peas as routine work. These were the simplest of preparations, requiring good timing and no adornment, and reserved the asparagus for herself, because the first asparagus of any year was a thing Agnes cooked herself on the grounds that it occurred once a year and deserved attention. She wrote in the book, May 1884, kitchen garden begins well. Asparagus first crop from the new bed. 12 spears served for the family luncheon with the simplest possible preparation. No sauce, no salt at the table. The asparagus at this quality requires nothing but itself. Agnes taught Effie the soufflé in May. The soufflé was the dish she had been holding back since the previous November as the marker of a certain level of readiness, and by May she judged that Effie was ready. Not because Effie's technique was perfect, it was not yet perfect, but because Effie had demonstrated over the course of the winter's lessons the specific quality that the soufflé required above all others. She did not panic when things went wrong. She chose a cheese soufflé for the first lesson, which was the most reliable of the soufflé's forms, and the one most likely to succeed on the first attempt, which it was important to do. A first soufflé that failed would create in a student's mind an anxiety about the dish that was harder to correct than any technical error. The soufflé rose. It was correctly set at the center and properly golden at the top. Agnes timed it with her pocket watch. The timing, Agnes said. The soufflé is done when the timing says it is done, not when the color says it is done, and not when it looks done. The color and the appearance will deceive you. The timing will not. Effie wrote, the soufflé. Trust the timing above everything. Agnes made one amendment to the note when she saw it. She added the word else. Trust the timing above everything else. Because you did not ignore the appearance entirely. You used it to confirm what the timing told you. The timing was first. The appearance confirmed. By June, the kitchen had the quality it had in high summer, and which was different from any other season. The days were long. The light was good from 4 in the morning to 10 at night. The kitchen garden was producing abundantly, and the window that in November looked out on grey hills now looked out on green hills and the pale blue of the summer sky. The ranges were still going, but could be managed at a lower level. The oven was used less for the long cooked dishes and more for the shorter cooking summer produce. Agnes found June the most pleasant month for cooking. Not the most interesting. August had more interesting material, but the most pleasant. The abundance of the kitchen garden in June was without the pressure of the shooting season. She had good produce and time to work with it properly, and Effie beside her who was, by June, capable of taking a significant portion of the daily kitchen work without supervision. She wrote in the book in mid-June, June 1884. Effie is now managing the family luncheon independently every day. The evening family dinners she manages with me in the kitchen, but making the majority of the decisions herself. I'm present as a check, not a director. This is the correct relationship for this stage of her development. She paused before writing the next sentence, and then wrote it. I believe she will be an excellent cook. The August preparations began in the last week of June, which was 6 weeks before the shooting party arrived, but which was the right amount of time to do them properly. Agnes's August preparations were not a list of tasks to be done in sequence, but a set of readiness conditions to be achieved. The game larder scrubbed and the hooks cleaned, the preserving stores reviewed and the gaps identified for the provisioner's order, the menus planned with Lady Helen in the annual kitchen meeting, the batterie de cuisine inspected and the damaged items replaced, the kitchen maid's duties for the season assigned. The menu meeting with Lady Helen was scheduled for the first Thursday of July. Agnes prepared for it with a list of proposed menus. 4 weeks of shooting season dinners, each one different, each one drawing on the estate's produce in the correct seasonal order, which she had been composing in the kitchen book since May. She had been planning menus for Lady Helen for 20 years, and the meeting had a comfortable rhythm. Lady Helen suggested changes which Agnes noted and incorporated without argument when they were improvements, and noted and incorporated when they were not improvements, because Lady Helen's preferences were the master's preferences, and the master's preferences were the kitchen's brief. This year Lady Helen had one new request. She had been staying in Edinburgh with a friend whose cook had served a pottage of leeks and cream that she had found notable. She wondered if Agnes could do something similar. Agnes said she could. She wrote in the book, Lady Helen, leek and cream potage, probably based on vichyssoise or a similar French preparation. Research and test before August. She wrote to John Ross that evening, because if anyone in the Highland Cook Network would know about leek and cream potage, it would be John. On the morning of the 10th of August, 2 days before the 1884 season opened, Agnes rose at her usual 4 o'clock and went, before lighting the range, into the game larder. She did this most mornings of the season. The check of the larder was the first act of the kitchen day, ahead of the range, ahead of the tea. But this morning, with the season 2 days away, the larder was empty, and she went into it not to check anything, but to stand in it for a moment. The larder in August before the season was a clean room. The cold stone walls reflected the small lamp she carried. The iron hooks were empty. The shelves held the salt and the hanging strings, and nothing else. The larder smelled of cold stone and the faint herbal note of the bunches of dried thyme and rosemary. She hung from the central beam to keep the air clean. She stood in the larder with her lamp and thought about the season to come. In 2 days, Hamish would knock at the kitchen door at 5:30, and the larder would begin to fill. The 16 notebooks on the dresser shelf contained 21 years of the produce that had hung in this larder and been cooked in the kitchen beyond it. The 16th notebook, the current one, was perhaps a third full. There were perhaps 8 or 10 more years of notebooks to come before her hands told her it was time. She thought about Effie. Effie's small notebook was now into its 4th month of serious use. Not the initial learning notes, but the real cook's notes, the tested recipes, and the amendments. It was not a kitchen book yet, but it was becoming one. Agnes stood in the cold larder with her lamp for 5 minutes. Then she went out and lit the range. The 12th of August, 1884, was a Tuesday, which was an ordinary weekday, and the shooting season opened as the Game Act required it to open, on the 12th itself, without the previous year's Sunday complication. Hamish knocked at the kitchen door at 7:30 on the morning of the 12th with the first brace, 2 birds, the first of the season, carried in the manner of a man who understood that this was a first and not merely a routine delivery. Agnes took the birds. She looked at them. Young, well-conditioned, the first good sign of a new season. She thanked Hamish, who said, "Good year for the birds. The moor's full." He said the same thing every year when the year looked good, and Agnes always received it with the same feeling, the controlled satisfaction of a cook who had been waiting for this information and now had it. She wrote in the 16th notebook, August 12th, 1884. Season opens. First birds, excellent. Party of 16 arriving Thursday. Effie ready. She looked at the last 2 words for a moment. Effie ready. Not Effie learning, not Effie progressing. Ready. This was a different statement from anything she had written about Effie in the previous 2 years. She thought about whether it was accurate and decided it was. She went back to the range. On the 2nd Tuesday of the season, the 19th of August, Agnes gave Effie the family dinner. Not the shooting party dinner. The full party dinner for 16 was still Agnes's, but the Macpherson family dined separately from the guests on Tuesday evenings, which was their custom, and the Tuesday family dinner was a smaller and in some ways more demanding test than the large party dinner, because the smaller the table, the more clearly any failure showed. Agnes left the kitchen at 5 o'clock. She went to her room and sat there for 2 hours, which was the most difficult 2 hours she had spent in the kitchen in recent memory. Not because she believed Effie would fail, but because sitting in her room while someone else ran her kitchen was against every instinct she had developed in 21 years. She read. She did not hear any sounds from the kitchen below that indicated difficulty. At 7 o'clock she came downstairs. The kitchen was clean and ordered. The service had gone up. Effie was standing at the range with the timing of the dessert under control. Agnes looked at the kitchen. She looked at Effie. How did the service go? Smoothly, Effie said. I was 3 minutes early on the 2nd course, and I held it correctly. Agnes tasted what remained of the sauce. She looked at Effie. Good. She did not say more than that, because good was what it was, and good was what it deserved. And saying more than that would have been dishonest, and also would have been too much. Effie understood. The composure on Effie's face was not pride. It was the composure of a cook who had run a dinner and had run it correctly and knew it. On a Sunday evening in the last week of August, the Sunday being the one evening of the week when the shooting season gave the kitchen a half rest, Agnes took the first of the kitchen books from the shelf and read it through from the beginning. She did this periodically, not every year, and never in the season's first days when there was no time, but sometimes when the season was in its established rhythm and the book on the dresser was the current volume and she had the evening. She would go back to the first notebook and read. The first notebook from 1869 held the recipes she had known at the age of 42, which was, she reflected, the age at which she had finally felt that she knew enough to begin recording what she knew. Before 42, she had been learning. At 42, she had understood that what she had was worth the permanence of a record. The first entry was the cocker-leekie from her grandmother's kitchen in Dunkeld, 1855. She had been eating that soup for 60 years. She had been cooking it for 30. She had been writing it in this book for 15, and it was still correct. She turned through the pages. She found the venison sauce entry from 1878, before the amendment she had written in 1883. She found the salmon entry with its single added sentence, "There is no recovery from an overcooked salmon." She found the first entry of Jean Ross's Rowan Collop, written in August 1883 in the rapid hand she used when she was writing during the season. She put the notebook down. She wrote in the current book, August 1884. The first notebook remains entirely usable. The recipes in it are correct. Some have been improved by amendment. None has been superseded. Hamish knocked his 3 knock-knock on the 4th Thursday of August and delivered the morning's birds as he delivered them every morning. He was 62. Agnes was 56. They had been conducting this exchange at this kitchen door for 21 years. Neither of them had ever discussed the 21 years, because neither of them was the kind of person who discussed such things directly. But on this Thursday, Hamish said, after the birds had been handed over, "The Colonel says there's talk of a new gamekeeper next year, young man from Strathtyre." Agnes looked at him. "He says he's looking for an assistant for me," Hamish said. "Not a replacement." He said this with the flat inflection of a man who was relaying information and not his interpretation of it. "An assistant," Agnes said. "Aye." There was a pause. Agnes had been breaking in young kitchen maids at this same kitchen for 21 years, and she understood the arrangement being described from her own experience with it. An assistant who was learning the work from someone who was still doing it, and who would, when the time came, take it over, the work continuing. "The young man from Strathtyre," Agnes said. "Has he been on the moor before?" "Strathbran Moor, 3 years." Hamish paused. "He knows the work. He needs the specific ground." "Then it will be fine," Agnes said. Hamish nodded. He left. Agnes brought the birds in. She hung them in the larder. She wrote in the book, August 1884. Hamish is to have an assistant in 1885. The ground knowledge passes. September 1884 was, Agnes judged, slightly easier than September 1883, and the reason was Effie. Not because Effie had made September easier in any obvious way. The volume of produce and the demands of the party were the same as the previous year, but because having a second cook who could be trusted with the luncheon and the simpler family meals freed Agnes to do what she did best, which was to concentrate entirely on the larger demands and not divide her attention. She gave Effie the venison collop on the 3rd Tuesday of September. Not the saddle, which was Agnes's dish, the collop, which was the smaller cut, and which Agnes had been doing herself since she had developed the recipe with John's contribution the previous year. Effie made the rowan sauce from the kitchen yard berries exactly as the book described, with Agnes's amendment regarding the reduction time. She brought it to Agnes to taste before service. Agnes tasted it. "The rowan," Agnes said. "Yes," Effie said, "the hill." Agnes looked at her. Effie had not been present in the kitchen on the day the previous August when Agnes had asked her the same question, and she had given the same answer. She had read it in the book, Agnes's entry recording Effie's own answer. She had read her own answer in someone else's record and learned from it what it meant. Agnes added nothing to the sauce. It was correct. In the last week of September, Agnes reviewed the 16th notebook to assess how much remained for the year. She had been using it since March. It was now 2/3 full. By December, it would be complete, and the 17th would be opened in the winter. She turned to the game entry she had written in January, the long entry for the cook who comes after. She read it through. It was still accurate. Nothing in the 1884 season had required her to amend it. She added a single paragraph at the end. "I have not altered the preceding text after reading it in September 1884. It remains correct. The one addition I would make now: a cook who comes to this kitchen in the future should know that the rowan berry sauce for venison, added to the book in August 1883, is one of the best things in these 16 volumes. It came from John Ross at Struan House, who had it from the cook at Dalnacardock Lodge, who had arrived at it herself in the way that all the best recipes arrive, not invented but discovered, and then passed on. She read this paragraph twice after writing it. She thought about the chain, the Dalnacardock cook to Jean, to Agnes, to Effie, and into Effie's own small notebook. She thought about the chain going further. Effie's notebook, the one in her apron pocket, becoming Effie's kitchen book in some future kitchen, the recipe in it having passed through 4 kitchens already, each one improving it slightly, each one adding its own note. She wrote in the margin of the paragraph, "And to whoever reads this after, the last guests of the 1884 season departed on the 4th of October. Agnes closed the season as she closed every season. The game larder cleared and scrubbed, the battery cleaned and rehung, the season's produce inventoried, and the preserving calendar set. She wrote in the book, October 4th, 1884, season closed. Second season with Effie as second cook. Assessment: a significantly better kitchen than last year. No failures. The venison collop passed to Effie entirely. The Tuesday family dinners hers throughout. Ready for more in 1885. She paused. Then she wrote because it was true, and she did not see the use of not writing what was true. Agnes Drummond, age 57 next March. 22 years in this kitchen, 23 from next spring. The body remains good, the hands are reliable, the mind is clear. There are perhaps 8 years of cooking remaining before the retirement that Lady Helen has indicated will be comfortable and well provided. 8 years is enough time to complete Effie's training to a first cook standard. This is the work of the winters ahead." She closed the book. She went to the kitchen window. The October hills were in their full color again. Gold birches, brown heather, the first dusting of snow on the high tops that she could see on a clear day like today. The kitchen yard was swept. The preserving shelves were beginning to fill. In the first week of November, Agnes asked Effie if she might read Effie's notebook. She had not read it since the spring. She had made it a practice not to read it too frequently, because a student's notebook ought to be the student's own thinking rather than a transcription of what the teacher would expect. And she wanted to see what the last year had produced. Effie brought it to the kitchen dresser without hesitation. Agnes read it for an hour while Effie did the evening preparations. The notebook was nearly full. Effie had used the small pages closely in a handwriting that was neat but not precious. The recipes were correct and the notes were her own. Not Agnes's words translated, but Effie's own observations, which was the best possible thing. The venison collop entry read, Rowan berry sauce, reduced to coating consistency. Sauce, Mrs. Ross at Struan House, via Mrs. Drummond, Ardvreck. Test note, The Hill. The brevity of the test note made Agnes pause. The Hill. 3 words, the exact description, no more needed. She read the soufflé entry. Trust the timing above everything else. Not the color, not the look, the timing. She found the stock entry. The stock is not the meal. It is what makes the meal possible. She found, near the end of the book, a page headed, What I have learned at Ardvreck, 1882 to 1884, with a list of approximately 30 items, each one a sentence, each one the kind of knowledge that existed only in the hands of someone who had done the work. Agnes read the list to the end. She closed the notebook and set it on the dresser. You need a second notebook, she said. A larger one. Effie said, I thought so. Agnes went to Pitlochry on the following Tuesday and bought Effie's second notebook. A larger quarto, the same size as Agnes's own notebooks from the 3rd volume onward, with good cream-coloured pages and a cover that would last. She paid for it from her own pocket, which was the right thing to do, and brought it back to the kitchen and set it on the dresser shelf beside Effie's first notebook, in the position on the shelf that was closest to Effie's end of the dresser. Effie arrived the next morning at 5 o'clock, as she arrived every morning, and saw the notebook on the shelf. Is that for me? Yes. You bought it? Yes. Effie picked it up. She turned it over in her hands. She opened the cover. She looked at the first blank page, which was the page on which, at some point in the next day, or week, or month, she would write the first entry of what would become, Agnes believed, a kitchen book of her own. She said, What should the first entry be? Agnes thought for a moment. Then she said, The first thing you know well enough to write down without checking another source. She paused. The cock-a-leekie from your grandmother's kitchen, if you have one, or the broth from your mother's. Start with what you already know and have always known. The rest comes after. On the last day of November, Agnes completed the 16th notebook. She wrote the November closing entry. November 1884. Winter teaching underway. Effie's second notebook begun. The first entry she wrote, her mother's Scotch broth from the family house in Dunkeld, remembered from childhood. I told her to write it without checking another source, and she did. The entry is accurate, and the recipe is correct, and the note at the bottom is entirely her own. This is the first thing I ever ate that someone else made. I have been trying to match it since. Agnes read this. She wrote in her own closing paragraph, Effie Gillies will be an excellent cook. I'm certain of this now. The certainty is not a prediction. It is an observation of what she already is. She has the hand, and she has the mind, and she has the patience, and she has the quality I could not teach her and could only wait to discover. She knows why the cooking matters. She knows it is not performance. It is knowledge, and the record of knowledge, and the passing of knowledge from one set of hands to the next. She signed the entry, the only entry in the 16 volumes she had ever signed. Agnes Drummond, head cook, Ardvreck House, November 30th, 1884. She closed the 16th notebook. She placed it on the shelf. She opened the 17th on the desk. She wrote the date, December 1st, 1884. She wrote the first entry. She stayed at the kitchen dresser for an hour after writing the first entry of the 17th notebook. The entry was a recipe. The leek and cream pottage that John Ross had sent in response to Agnes's inquiry in the late summer, which Agnes had tested in September for the family, and which she now wrote into the new notebook in the form that Ardvreck House's kitchen had made its own. A Perthshire leek and cream soup, with a note on the use of the garden's first autumn leeks, and at the end, a single line of origin. This recipe came from a cook in Edinburgh, whose name I do not know, by way of John Ross at Struan House, by way of Lady Helen Macpherson, who ate it in Edinburgh and thought it notable. It was. The note was, she thought, the correct form of the kitchen book at its best. The recipe, the sauce, the chain, the assessment. 4 things on one page. The accumulated knowledge of more than one kitchen, more than one cook, more than one test, arriving in this form in the 17th notebook of the Ardvreck kitchen book on the 1st of December, 1884. She looked up from the notebook at the kitchen around her. The 2 Carron ranges on the north wall, the smaller banked and the larger at its overnight level, the long oak preparation table, scrubbed pale, the copper batterie de cuisine on the walls, each piece in its place, the high window, dark, the December night outside, the scullery door, the game larder door, Effie's apron on its peg, the 17 notebooks on the dresser shelf, the first 16 completed, the 17th begun. She thought about the cook who had been in this kitchen before her, a woman called Mrs. Sutherland, whom Agnes had known only by reputation, who had left the kitchen in 1862 when Agnes had arrived, and who had left no notebook and no record beyond the reputation for good plain cooking that the older household staff still spoke of. Mrs. Sutherland's knowledge had been in Mrs. Sutherland's hands. When Mrs. Sutherland had gone, the knowledge had gone with her. Agnes looked at the 17 notebooks. Not these. These would stay. She banked the range for the night. She checked the larder door and the scullery door. She looked at the kitchen once more. The copper in the last ember light, the table pale in the dark, Effie's apron on its peg, the notebooks on the shelf. Then she took her candle and she went upstairs to bed, and the kitchen behind her was quiet and in order, and in the morning she would rise at 4 and come down and light the range, and the kitchen would begin again. This was what it was. This was what it had been for 21 years, and what it would be for 8 years more. The knowledge accumulated in the notebooks. The knowledge accumulated in the hands beside her. The range burned. The kitchen continued. If tonight's story helped you drift into rest, you're always welcome here at Soft Sleep Tales. Whenever you need a quiet story, there will always be another waiting for you. Sleep well.